In nearly every battle, the first sound that rises above the roar of combat is the urgent cry for the medic. It is the medic, more than anyone else, who witnesses up close the human cost of war. And because of the contribution medicine makes to winning a war, unfortunately, it is the medic who has become a primary target on the modern battlefield. They called it the worst place on earth, the jungle combat zone of Vietnam. At the height of the war, over 1,000 calls a week came in for medevac rescue aid, known to the soldiers as dust-off.
Dust-off 7-4, this is Banshee 6-5, go.
Raider Alpha 6, long bid dust-off control, over.
This is Raider Alpha 6. I have an urgent dust-off mission. Coordinates Yankee Uniform 607.
They are a coordinated team of doctors, nurses, pilots, and medics practicing combat medicine while under fire. Always with the clock ticking down, they fly out knowing that somewhere out there, in the dark heart of the killing fields, some soldier's life is in their hands.
There's a different level that a medic has to operate on, and so you had to carry faith as much as pills.
People who are dying, in my experience, there's a very distinct odor. It's indescribable. And I don't know whether it's a combination of the blood and the torn bodies, and that, I mean, it's indescribable.
You couldn't show fear. I mean, you had to show confidence. That was half the skill of being a medic, is to support not only those wounded, but let the other guys know that, hey, Doc knows what he's doing. My buddy's going to be all right. And if I get hit, Doc's going to be there to take care of me. You had to be a magician. You had to be a spiritual advisor.
The medic's tedious and deadly job is one that no amount of training can really prepare them for, even if they are lucky enough to live through their tour of duty. Each survivor comes back a very changed man, most claiming it's the hardest thing they've ever done.
My wife once said that she married a boy and ended up living with a man. I guess when I went into the service, I was a boy. War made me a man.
If it's nighttime, you may look out ahead 15, 20, 30 miles and see aircraft dropping flares. You may see jets out strafing with machine guns or dropping napalm or bombs. And 100% of the time, that's the place you're going.
The dust-off bird was inbound with, they said, 5 casualties, and I remember going out to the helicopter as it landed, and somehow they'd managed to put all 5 casualties into one litter basket. And I couldn't tell where one body began and the other left off. There were obviously 5 men there, but there weren't 5 sets of arms and legs.
It got to where my answer to handling it on flights many times was I never looked in the back seat sometimes. You know, you could hear the screams and the moans and the groans, and I just never looked back a lot of times.
Their battle assignment is to save lives, even at the cost of their own. They are non-combatant soldiers. Whatever arms they carry are defensive weapons for the protection of their patients, but their bravery is unquestioned. The medic's duty is so perilous that it consistently generates clusters of Purple Hearts and Medals of Honor.
There's no doubt in my mind the absolutely toughest thing in that job, but the toughest part of that job is going out and picking up one of your own crews that's gone down. And bringing the bodies in, and almost every case they're horribly mutilated and they're burned, and you don't know Johnny Jones from, you know, Harry Smith. And then as the commander, writing those letters home to the next of kin.
Probably my scariest moment was becoming conscious upside down in a burning helicopter in the hills in Vietnam, and crawling out and realizing that I almost became a statistic myself. That's the kind of thing that lives with you forever.
Whenever there was a firefight in Vietnam, the initial few seconds would be moments of terror where, you know, everybody would get down and find a safe position, a relatively safe position, and immediately return fire. The one person that couldn't do this or couldn't stay down would usually be the medic, because there'd be calls for doc, medic up, and the medic would have to move, hopefully crawl unexposed, but still move towards that call for medic. And that would expose him to risk and situations that result in a very high casualty rate among medics.
And there is always the uncertainty. The enemy is known to monitor medevac radio frequencies, often calling the air ambulances into a deadly ambush with bogus distress calls. It is only when they are right on top of the scene that the medics know for sure whether they are to meet with some desperate, stricken soldier or murderous enemy fire.
Number of occasions we had situations where very obviously the enemy was trying to lure an aircraft into the wrong LZ.
How do you know it's not a friendly Vietnamese with bad English that's calling you in versus a North Vietnamese with bad English?
You know, to some extent, that almost gets to be kind of a game as you begin to make an approach. And you're betting that I can get in there, you're betting with the, if you will, the Viet Cong, that I can get in there and get out of there without you getting me. I'm quick and I'm stealthy, and my crew is really good. And they can load this aircraft up within about 30 seconds of me getting on the ground. And that's not enough time for you to get up out of your hole and for you to level effective fire on them.
They learn what all medics in war before them learn, that they are really facing two enemies, the armed enemy combatant standing before them, and death itself, their own death and the death of their patients.
If you spend more than about 30 seconds in an LZ, things are going to get bad. That depends on the guys in the back. There's nothing you can do about it. That 30 seconds that you sit there in the LZ waiting for the crew to load up those patients so you can get out is the longest 30 seconds in the history of time. You just know that that windshield is going to disappear with bunches of little bullet holes. I've looked at the pilot over next to me sometimes, guys ducking back and forth. Like, seriously, guys, what are you doing? Well, he's not going to get me, but there's the feeling that somebody out there is looking at him through a sniper scope or something, I don't know. And so he's ducking back and forth.
When you have someone else's life in your hands, it's a feeling of intense responsibility. It may have been one of the reasons why we lost so many pilots and crew. It's because you get so wrapped up and involved in saving that life that you let the emotion of the patient's need override the common sense of the mission at hand. And you allowed yourself to get into situations that you couldn't fly out of.
You come away hating war, but again feeling that you're glad that you were there and you were able to save a life or to do something that was good.
It was everything that I ever expected it to be. The one job where you can come home at night and count on your fingers and toes, you know, exactly what you've done that day. You know, I've saved X number of lives today. There is no more rewarding feeling than that, I don't think. If there is, I can't find it, and if I could find it, I'd go do it.
Probably the hardest part of the job is when you don't make it. When you work so hard to save a guy's life, and that person dies.
all battlefield assignments, perhaps the most dangerous is that of the medic. Often unarmed, up front, under fire, he carries out his grim duty. The success or failure of these warriors of compassion is often measured in increments of life and death. World War I would become the first major war where disease would not play as big a role in fatality counts as battle. But it also introduced a whole new set of medical and battlefield problems brought on by the rapidly expanding scope of new instruments of war.
World War I really changed things significantly. You had the new weapons that had been developed were so much more horrible and so much more destructive than what had been seen before. You had artillery pieces of tremendous size. You had machine guns, heavy use of machine guns, especially during the Verdun campaign, where thousands and thousands of men were mowed down in, it seemed like, minutes. You also had the submarine, unrestricted submarine warfare being used in the North Atlantic. Torpedoes, mines, the use of the airplane for the first time in warfare, and probably most horribly, the use of poison gas. Mustard gas and phosgene gas, which not only killed outright, if you were lucky enough to die outright, that was good, but generally speaking, those who were gassed lingered in agonizing pain, struggling for breath. And men many years later who survived wished they hadn't as a result of the use of poison gas.
I was gassed twice. A gas shell explodes with a soft crump. Crump. When you hear that, you know you're going to be gassed in a few minutes. This dark, dirty, gray, green cloud comes drifting your way. The first time I was I went into convulsions because I couldn't breathe. And you can't see, your eyes are affected immediately, your nose. And if you get a nose full, it goes clear through your head and your ear cavities. And the best thing in the world is to get you out of there and lead you back to where there is no gas. Of course, some of the men lost their eyesight, and some of them died, coughed themselves to death.
It became imperative that the medics get closer to the fighting than ever before. In most previous wars, medics had stayed behind the lines. Now, they pushed their way onto the battlefield while the attack was still raging.
The whole thrust of taking a medical profession to war is to at least introduce some humanity onto what is basically one of the most savage things that a population can do, and that is go to war and try to kill each other.
It was already recognized that there was a magic period. If you could get to a patient, a wounded patient, within an hour, let's say, or within 2 hours of the wounding, the odds or the percentage of success in saving that patient went up considerably. Army medics and Navy corpsmen actually went out with the troops. And it was really their job to be out there at the side, almost at the side of the wounded patient. If a trooper, a Marine, or a soldier was hit, within minutes he'd be dragged to safety and see to it that the patient was returned to the rear lines where he could be seen by a physician.
The Geneva Convention of 1864 had declared that shooting unarmed medics was an immoral and uncivilized act.
The Geneva Accords, or Geneva Convention agreements, if you will, really were an attempt to civilize warfare, if that's possible. And medical personnel were protected under the Geneva Convention. A medic, for example, could not be armed. He could carry a sidearm, but only for the protection of himself and his patient. He was not supposed to carry an aggressive weapon such as a rifle.
Wearing red crosses to signify their non-combatant status, the medic's neutrality was generally honored by both sides in the conflict, but it was still extremely hazardous duty, demanding tremendous bravery.
The trench warfare had certainly developed to some degree, and you think of World I as being trench warfare, but when they got tired of sitting in their trenches and they needed to take territory, which was the whole concept of warfare, taking the enemy's territory, you had to get up out of those trenches, and when you got out of the trenches and started across no man's land, there was no protection at all. The idea of sending massed troops across no man's land in the face of incredible fire from machine guns and other weapons and artillery was just incredibly stupid. It's just incalculable that any officer could be stupid enough to send his men out in that. And so that's why there were certainly hundreds of thousands more casualties in World War I.
Even with these safeguards, by war's end, nearly 3,000 medical personnel had lost their lives in the line of duty due to indiscriminate enemy fire and bombing raids.
It was a very impersonal thing. War had changed significantly from what it had been earlier. You no longer had to see your enemy. He was out there somewhere, and you didn't have to face him the way you did over a parapet with a bayonet and look him in the eye. It was much different.
Countless more were wounded. One of them, a brave young ambulance driver, Ernest Hemingway, suffered wounds that would plague him for the rest of his life. Just 20 years after World War I, another global war broke out. Tragically, the savagery of this war may have surpassed that of the previous conflict. Medical aid during World War II was more effective than ever before due to advances in the treatment of shock and the use of a new drug, penicillin.
When World War II started, what did we have in hand? We had much better understanding of how to use blood in shock. We had a set of specialized surgeons and specialized people in internal medicine. We had the introduction and then testing and proof that penicillin was truly a wonder drug. So you have a very different outcome for the wounded. The died of wounds rate was 8% in World War I. That means a man is wounded, he's in the hospital, and he dies under medical care. And it was 4% in World War II.
The Medical Corps continued to push the boundaries of bravery and dedication to duty as far as they would go. But it was during this war that the game changed for them.
There's an interesting difference between, for the Americans certainly, in the two theaters of World War II. That is the European theater, North Africa, Mediterranean, European, and the Pacific.
In the European and African theaters, the battles were fought in a more traditional fashion in cities and on battlefields that had been contested for centuries. The Geneva Accords were generally honored.
From the point of view of German and Italian honoring the Red Cross, yes. Any incidents that happened were isolated. They were usually punished by the local commander if he found out about them. And so you had the hospitals were marked, the corpsmen wore their brassard, the ambulances were marked, and so on, and both sides respected the Geneva Convention. It's a very different war in the Pacific. It was I won't call it a small unit war, but it was a war that was fought by small units of men in jungles, men scarcely able to see very far, up against a very wily, very tenacious, very determined enemy.
The Japanese proved to be brilliant jungle fighters. The battles fought, as the war moved from island to island, at such places as Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, were amongst the most brutal and savage ever recorded in the history of warfare.
The Japanese were fine soldiers, and they did not respect the Geneva Convention. And I'm not sure why, I don't know, because they certainly had in the Russo-Japanese War. They began not to respect it when they went into China in 1937. And by the time of the Philippine campaign, that is the first one, Bataan and so on, something had happened in the Japanese military psyche. It turned a previously honorable Japanese soldier and Japanese command structure into the kinds of structures that gave us the Bataan Death March, that gave us the bridge on the River Kwai, prison camps, and so on. And this was true in the battlefield as well.
In the first 2 weeks that I was there, I found out that all the things our intelligence people had told us were true. The Japanese, in that battle at least, were a savage and uncivilized enemy. They killed anybody and everybody that they could reach with one of their weapons. There was no question in anybody's mind that Guadalcanal was going to be a fight to the death of the last man if it came down to that.
The imperial forces of Japan fought a no-holds-barred war, and they were quick to realize how much damage they could do to their allied adversaries if they knocked out their enemy's medical capabilities.
It was said that the red cross on your helmet was a naming stake, and they took them off or overpainted them, stopped wearing the brassard. There was no point in marking hospitals because the Japanese didn't care. They'd bomb and attack. They did, in fact, bayonet patients in hospitals. They did not respect the Red Cross. Now, you couldn't assume that your patients would be safe from aimed fire or from attack by infantry units. It became very different. It was a nastier war. It was a nastier war for the patients. It was a nastier war for the corpsmen and the medical people. It was a nastier war for the soldier.
And it was here that some medics began to carry arms into the field, ostensibly as defensive weapons for the protection of their patients and themselves.
The day I arrived at Guadalcanal and they checked me in, when I checked out, I had a .45 automatic and a Springfield rifle. And I knew then that I was in a different war.
Nurse Corps officers also fell into harm's way.
During World War II, in May of 1942, with the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, 66 Army Nurse Corps officers, as well as Navy Nurse Corps officers, were captured by the Japanese when General Wainwright surrendered. These nurses were interred by the Japanese as prisoners of war for more than 3 years until liberated in February of 1945.
They served their time heroically.
Nurses were serving on a hospital ship in the Pacific when it was strafed and bombed by a kamikaze, who eventually plummeted the plane into the hospital ship. And a number of Army Nurse Corps officers, as well as other kinds of medics, physicians and medics, lost their life with the bombing of that hospital ship.
That war was very, very tough. And add to that tropical disease. I've mentioned malaria, there were others. Dengue fever, various viral infections, skin rot, sicker troops, all told. It was not... If you had your choice, go fight for Eisenhower, don't fight for MacArthur.
At the same time, a new technological innovation was being developed behind the scenes, a miracle machine, the helicopter. These highly mobile air ambulances advanced the effectiveness of medevac crews. The copters were in their infancy during World War II, but came to full maturity in the Korean War, where they were used to transport the wounded into the MASH hospitals.
And so the Army said, all right, it is a good idea, it does work, we'll do it. And they introduced then the little bubble machine, the H-13 helicopter with the 2 pods on the side, the patient carried outside. And it was magnificent.
The patient could be taken care of within an hour of being wounded. That magic time that indicates survival or death.
Through movies and television shows dealing with Korean War MASH hospitals, the public has seen its largest glimpse of military medics in action. Although glamorized by Hollywood, the movie depictions of the medics' dark, cynical humor and the tough life and death decisions do hold a grain of truth.
The MASH humor that you've seen in various other films and stuff like that is very realistic.
Gross.
It's a kind of a recognition also that if you just can't laugh about things a little bit, if you can't find some kind of humor, and to some extent you're laughing at yourself, then the job's just not worth doing and it's getting to you.
It was a way in which you could blow off steam. to try to make some kind of sanity out of the madness that you were seeing every day. No one understands the absolute waste of war more than a person that's picking up the residue. And if you dwelled on it, I don't think you could survive. I really don't. You would not come out sane.
One fact the MASH films left out were the Medals of Honor for bravery.
Out of a total of 7 Medals of Honor that were awarded to sailors or people connected with the Navy, 5 of them were awarded to Navy corpsmen.
The medical evacuation system in Vietnam was the most efficient of any war in history. A battle casualty in this war stood a better chance of survival than in any previous war. With over 300,000 Americans wounded, the medics got lots of practice. The medics' status on the battlefield during this war had risen to unprecedented heights. Now the death of a medic could demoralize an entire unit.
If I were an enemy facing an American combat squad in the field, I would think among the most effective targets that I would like to engage would be the radio telephone operator and that medic.
If they lose their commo and they lose their medic, it's going to have a tremendous demoralizing effect on the average infantryman.
Did the Viet Cong do that in Vietnam? I can tell you we took a whole lot of holes in aircraft in the close proximity to Red Crosses. Sounds like a pretty good aiming point to me.
Also, their marriage to the Huey helicopter proved to be one of the most beneficial relationships between man and machine in the history of warfare. Tens of thousands of American soldiers owe their lives to the efficiency of these air ambulances and their obsessively brave crews.
It has very, very seldom failed to do even the most ridiculous things I've asked it to do. And it's been very, very forgiving, even when I've been to the extremes of the performance envelope. A superb aircraft, any way you look at it.
If the helicopter didn't exist, it would have been invented for Vietnam because it was the perfect vehicle.
In Vietnam, there's no question it was a lifesaver. It was an absolute lifesaver. There were no roads in many of the places we fought. The dust-off, tremendously heroic people. A number of these guys were killed. Their helicopters, something like 400 or 500 of them were shot down. Tremendously brave guys.
And the pilots matched the excellence of the machines.
I can't think of a situation where a helicopter never made it to us when it was called. Despite bad weather, day or night, enemy fire, the Huey helicopter and the dust-off crew always seemed to show up within literally 10, 15, 20 minutes. We had instances where pilots would fly in weather so bad that there was virtually no visibility, that they're in fog or rain conditions, typhoon. I think the pilots were probably the most capable of all helicopter pilots.
What scares you to death is running in to thunderstorms, to bad weather, where all those things are going to hell in a heartbeat, and nothing you can do about it.
When I flew, there were 2 things that I worried about more than anything else. One of them was getting shot down and getting badly burned. The second was getting captured. And I could control the second, maybe. And so when I flew, I was armed to the teeth. I carried, as a minimum, a .38, and for a period of time I had an M2 carbine that I sawed off and or an M16. And then I also carried some hand grenades, which, believe it or not, are not considered defensive type weaponry. And I flat was not going to allow myself to get policed up. And I think that was the primary feeling of everybody I flew with. Now, some folks carried it to the extreme. You had some pilots and crew members look like Pancho Villa, rolling through the plains.
The helicopter teams had some built-in handicaps also.
You will never sneak up on anybody in a UH-1. I mean, they're going to hear you coming for miles, so it was loud.
Sometimes a helicopter is a perfect target, a perfect sitting duck.
As far as pulling a hoist mission, it is probably the most nerve-wracking time that you can have. You ask a guy, I said, hey, well, what's the enemy situation down there? I say, well, there's no enemy contact. Well, excuse me, how did this guy get shot if there's no enemy contact? I mean, something doesn't jive here. So you hover over this thing, you drop down your anchor, which is basically what that hoist is, and you're permanently affixed to that. You're sitting there the whole time where you know everybody within 2,000 meters can see you.
You're always afraid of getting shot. You have an armor seat, but it only takes one bullet to bring a helicopter down.
It is without a doubt the most apprehensive time that you have. It's the worst mission. When you're the hoist bird and that first mission rolls in, that is not a good feel. I did not look forward to those. That was not a fun mission at all. At all.
I got shot 5 times at real close range, right in the chest and the upper torso. I was really fortunate to come through it. And I'm sure that if that medic hadn't been there, that I wouldn't have been here today. I mean, he really saved my life.
I took a round in the head, and by the time I hit the ground, the medic was already there. He never really thought about himself. I can remember times where we would be in a firefight, and he'd move around like oblivious to the fact that there was incoming.
You almost have to experience it to believe the dedication and the self-sacrifice that these guys, they put their life on the line continuously.
And to this day, I don't know his name except Doc. That's all we ever called him. He was always the first one there. Whenever he had an instinct that somebody was hurt, and he was always there. I guess if you have to call anybody a hero, at least in our unit, it would have had to have been him.
Autoclave 5, Autoclave 5. This is dust off 106, over.
Out of the jungle, a patient would be greeted by a new team of hospital medics. Over 2,000 years ago, in ancient Greece, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, said he who would become a surgeon should join the army and follow it. This holds true even today. The combat physician's job is possibly the toughest in all medicine. A combat surgeon may see more trauma in one day of military duty than during a whole year in private practice. Operating in a battle zone and a hospital zone all at once, the decisions made by physicians here may alter the lives of their patients forever. Practicing combat medicine may also change the physicians themselves.
Does war change people? Yeah. It does affect you when you have dealt with a lot of damaged people. Whether that affect is, or effect is different for a young enlisted medic, 91 Alpha, we'd call him in the Army, or as opposed to the chief of surgery at an evac hospital, I don't know. Just getting older changes folks, and maybe war accelerates aging in an intellectual sense. I'm not really sure.
At their disposal was an incredible array of modern technology. If need be, a patient could be whisked through a chain of medical evacuation, including state-of-the-art hospital ships and waiting aircraft for immediate return to the United States. The basis for our modern advanced medevac system in civilian society today was innovated during the Vietnam War.
The thing that's most important to me is the priority that the American people place on the sanctity of one life, the importance of one life. I mentioned we dedicate an air medical evacuation system and a very, very expensive and highly technical medical system far forward on a battlefield. That is uncommon in most of the world's armed forces, and we're willing to do that. And that makes the American fighting forces a lot different than the other folks. And that's a big deal to me.
In 1990, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait triggered a countdown to what some believed would lead to another global war. The world held its collective breath, waiting for Saddam Hussein's response to the resolution that he withdraw his troops from the invaded country. Fearing the worst, United Nations forces instigated the greatest military and medical buildup since World War II.
The buildup for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm for the Army Medical Department started in August of 1990 and concluded at the start of the ground war in February of 1991.
The Gulf War really showed what this country could do when it has time to prepare. It was an incredible display of logistical talent.
Some 25,000 doctors, nurses, and healthcare technicians were put in place, bracing themselves for the possibility that they would face the medical nightmare of the 20th century.
Mobilization wasn't limited to personnel alone. It was also included equipment of vast numbers. 44 hospitals were sent to the Persian Gulf area and were in theater at the start of the ground war.
With weapons of war more lethal than ever, they prepared for a worst-case scenario, including the very real possibility of large-scale chemical warfare.
Most Army medical personnel were convinced that at some point, based upon Saddam Hussein's previous warfighting techniques, we would probably face a biological or chemical attack. So the urgency to be absolutely proficient in the techniques that would save not only your own lives, but save the lives of your patient became paramount in everybody's training routines. The training routines took on realism that was almost not to be believed. Victims were behaving or acting out symptoms that you would expect to see if somebody had indeed received an infusion of a biological or chemical agent. And the medical personnel were expected to respond accordingly. How does one put in an IV if somebody's in a chemical suit and still protect that patient? How does one get medication into a victim and still keep their chemical suit intact? What do nurses and physicians in a hospital do if a chemical alarm sounds and you have a ward full of patients who are not protected?
An additional danger, not only gas warfare, but biological warfare. Anthrax was the microbe that was particularly feared. And so there was an attempt to vaccinate.
Many military questions were unanswered. The old workhorse of medevac, the Huey helicopter, and the newer Black Hawk now appeared extremely vulnerable due to incredible advances in the accuracy of new surface-to-air missiles. There was the very real fear that helicopter-aided medevac rescues could be totally negated by the enemy in this desert war.
Things had changed. An infantryman armed with a heat-seeking missile launcher could easily do away with a helicopter. He could fire a missile and bye-bye helicopter, just like that, in a flash. Sand would have been a problem, perhaps. We ran into sand problems during the fateful, ill-fated, I should say, rescue mission in Iran some years earlier. And so it wasn't quite known how sand would affect all of this.
When the shooting war finally began, American troops were accompanied by the most elite group of medics to date.
These were units that were not part of the regular hospital. They were a select group of surgeons, an anesthesiologist, or a nurse anesthetist who separated from their unit and moved forward to treat casualties almost right there on the front lines. This is the first time that we have been that far forward with intensive critical capabilities.
Questions about poison gas warfare and the effectiveness of the helicopter remained unanswered as troops of the United Nations mercifully scored a lopsided victory over the Iraqi enemy. Indeed, most of the medical aid extended during this campaign was to Iraqi prisoners of war.
The personnel at this hospital expected 1,000 patients a day, 1,000 wounded Allied troops. They were surprised when they didn't see any. The first patients they saw were Iraqis. In fact, before they closed the hospital down a few days later, over 300 Iraqi prisoners of war had been treated, and really very few Americans. But they took the patients in. They followed meticulously the laws of war as outlined by the Geneva Conventions, and they treated these Iraqi prisoners as if they were their own patients.
the largest medical operation instigated for American casualties, came for the survivors of a tragic Scud missile attack.
The missile was a poorly constructed Scud missile. It was decomposing in the air and disintegrating in air. And one of the actual warheads separated from the body of the missile and struck a Saudi facility which housed a reserve unit from Pennsylvania.
Here were soldiers who were there ostensibly to take care of treating water supplies to make it safe for drinking. They didn't think that they were in it. But in the modern battlefield, nothing is immune. I believe 26 soldiers were killed in that, many more horribly burned and wounded.
And the hospital's training paid off. All this drilling and training that they had been doing prior to the ground war came through in magnificent shape because they were able to handle these casualties in a very even flow-through pattern, and those folks received just wonderful medical care in a very compacted period of time.
Some say the most important element for medics is the faith they keep in their black bags.
I carried some strange things in my aid bag. I carried a rosary. I wasn't Catholic, but it came in handy once in a while.
One other member of the combat team must always be mentioned with the medic, the chaplain. Amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, it is to these two non-combatants that the wounded turn. Their mission of mercy was summed up in a medic's prayer written during a distant war fought long ago. God of battle, grant that the wounded may safely arrive so that safeguards may surround them. Give me the instruments of my calling so that my work may be swift and accurate. Strengthen my hand. Endow me with the energy to go on through night and day. Let me never forget that a life is in my keeping, and do not let my judgment falter. Enable me to give renewed courage and hope to the living, and comfort to the dying. And let me never forget that in the battles to be won, that I too must play my part in the great calling. Amen. It's the medic's job to stem the tide of death on the killing fields. With medicine, machines, and human life caught in the balance, their goal, more than battle glory, is to fulfill a mission of mercy. Theirs is a situation of great irony, for what kind of soldier goes to war with the intent of saving lives?